I wasn't on the guest list for my own son's wedding. The woman at the entrance said without even looking at me, her clipboard held like a shield between us. And for a moment, I thought I had misheard her. That maybe the wind carrying the soft notes of the string quartet across the manicured lawn had twisted her words into something crueler than intended. But then she glanced up, her eyes traveling slowly from my worn shoes to the frayed sleeve of my coat, and I understood exactly what she meant. I adjusted the cuff instinctively, smoothing fabric that could not be smoothed, and behind her, past the white arch draped in roses and silk ribbons, I could see the rows of polished chairs filled with guests in tailored suits and flowing dresses. All of them turned toward the aisle where my son was standing, tall and composed, waiting for a bride who had already decided I did not belong. I had imagined this day differently. Of course I had. In every version I had ever held on to during the long nights when the house was quiet and the bills were stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, I was sitting in the front row, maybe wearing something simple but clean, something that said I was proud but not trying too hard, and Daniel would glance at me, just once, the way he used to when he was a boy on stage at a school play, searching for my face in the crowd before he found his confidence. But now he was looking everywhere except the entrance where I stood. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," the woman continued, her voice lower this time, more practiced, as if she had done this before, as if removing people like me was just another part of the schedule. And I nodded, because it was easier than explaining, easier than saying that I was Margaret Collins, that I had spent 30 years making sure the man at that altar had everything he needed to stand there today, that every late night, every second job, every quiet sacrifice had led to this exact moment. But none of that fit into the neat columns of her clipboard. A few guests near the entrance had started to notice, their conversations dipping into whispers that floated just close enough for me to catch pieces of them. Words like lost and confused, and something softer that sounded like pity, and I felt the heat rise in my chest, not sharp or explosive, but slow and heavy, like something settling into place. I could leave, I realized. I could turn around and walk back down the gravel path lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, get into the old car I had parked far from the main lot because I didn't want to draw attention, and disappear before anyone important saw me. And for a second, that seemed like the right thing to do, the quiet thing, the dignified thing. But then the music shifted, a cue in the ceremony, and Daniel turned his head slightly, just enough that his eyes swept across the crowd, and, for the briefest moment, landed on me. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he didn't even look surprised, he just paused, as if deciding whether or not I belonged in the same frame as the life he had built. And then he looked away. That was when I understood that this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a mix-up or a misunderstanding at the door. It was a decision, one that had been made long before I arrived, long before I stood here in a coat that had seen too many winters, holding on to an invitation that had never been meant to open any doors. "Please," the woman said again, gentler now, almost apologetic, and I gave her a small smile. The kind you offer a stranger when you don't want to make their job harder. And I stepped back, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes. The sound swallowed almost immediately by the music and the laughter and the life continuing without me. And as I turned slightly, not fully leaving yet, just enough to stand outside the line of sight, I caught a glimpse of the reflection in the glass of a nearby window, a woman with silver hair pulled neatly back, shoulders straight despite everything, eyes calm in a way that surprised even me. And I realized that whatever happened next, whatever this day was meant to become, I would not be the one to break first. I stayed just outside the entrance, close enough to hear the soft murmur of voices blending with the music, but far enough that no one had to acknowledge me, and for a while I simply stood there, watching the ceremony unfold as if it belonged to someone else, as if I were looking through a window into a life I had once been part of but no longer recognized. The sunlight reflected off the polished glasses carried by servers weaving through the guests, and every detail felt carefully arranged, every flower placed with intention, every chair aligned in perfect symmetry. The kind of precision that comes from people who have never had to choose between paying a bill and buying groceries. And I found myself noticing small things. The way a woman in a pale blue dress laughed too loudly at something that was not particularly funny. The way a man adjusted his cufflinks as if he were preparing for a photograph rather than a wedding. The way Olivia stood at the end of the aisle now, her dress catching the light, her posture flawless, her smile controlled. And I wondered if she had always been this certain about everything, or if certainty was something she had learned to wear like the rest of it. I could feel the weight of the invitation still in my hand, the paper slightly creased from the way I had held onto it during the drive, as if it might somehow prove something if anyone asked, as if it might open a door that had already been closed long before I arrived. And I slipped it quietly into my coat pocket, not out of defeat, but because I no longer needed it to understand where I stood. A breeze moved through the trees lining the property, carrying with it the faint scent of roses and something sharper underneath, something I could not quite place. And it reminded me of another afternoon years ago when Daniel was small, and we had walked through a park just a few miles from our old apartment. He had been holding my hand then, his grip firm and trusting, asking questions about everything he saw, and I had answered every one of them even when I did not have the answers. Because that was what you did when someone depended on you. You found a way to make the world feel steady. I watched him now as he spoke his vows, his voice steady, his expression composed, and I tried to find that boy in the man he had become. Tried to see some trace of the child who used to look at me like I was the answer to everything. But all I saw was someone who had learned to look past me, to place me somewhere outside the frame of his life, somewhere convenient and quiet. A couple near the edge of the seating area turned slightly in my direction, their eyes lingering just long enough to register that I did not belong, and then they turned back, their attention returning to the ceremony with practiced ease, and I realized that this was how it happened, not with loud declarations or dramatic confrontations, but with small, almost invisible choices, moments where people decided who mattered and who did not, and acted accordingly. I shifted my weight slightly, the gravel beneath my feet uneven but familiar, and for the first time since I had arrived, I felt something settle inside me, not anger, not even sadness, but a kind of clarity. The quiet understanding that this moment, as painful as it was not the beginning of anything. It was the confirmation of something that had been building for a long time, something I had chosen not to see, and as the guests began to rise for the next part of the ceremony, their chairs scraping softly against the ground, I stepped back another inch, just enough to let the moment pass without me, my hands resting calmly at my sides, my breathing steady, my presence unnoticed but no longer uncertain, as if I had finally stopped waiting for someone else to decide whether I belonged. The applause rose gently as the ceremony reached its final words, a soft wave of approval that moved through the seated guests like something rehearsed, something expected, and I watched as Daniel slipped the ring onto Olivia's finger with steady hands, the sunlight catching on the band for just a second before disappearing into the moment, and I realized that this was the part everyone would remember, the polished version of the day. The photographs, the laughter, the carefully chosen angles. That would tell a story of perfection, a story where nothing uncomfortable had ever existed. I remained where I was, just beyond the edge of the gathering, my presence reduced to a shadow that no one needed to step around, and for a while I let the scene play out without interruption, the officiant's voice warm and confident, the guests leaning forward at all the right moments, Olivia's expression softening just enough to suggest sincerity, and Daniel, always composed, always controlled, saying the words that were expected of him without hesitation. I wondered, briefly, if he believed them, if somewhere beneath the surface there was still a part of him that understood what promises meant, or if those had become just another set of phrases to be delivered at the appropriate time. When the ceremony ended, the chairs shifted again, the neat rows dissolving into clusters of conversation as people stood and stretched and reached for drinks offered by servers who moved with quiet efficiency, and the energy changed almost instantly, from something formal to something celebratory. The kind of transition that only works when everyone agrees to move forward together, leaving the previous moment neatly behind. I noticed how quickly the space filled with movement, laughter growing louder, glasses clinking, a photographer directing small groups into position, and I saw Olivia take Daniel's arm as they turned toward the reception area, her hand resting lightly but firmly, guiding him with a confidence that did not need to be spoken. He followed without resistance, his attention already shifting to the next part of the day, to the people waiting to congratulate him, to the life that was unfolding in front of him with effortless precision. No one looked toward the entrance anymore. No one glanced in my direction, and it was as if I had already disappeared from the narrative entirely. I took a slow breath and stepped back another few inches, feeling the distance grow not just physically, but something deeper, something that could not be measured in steps or feet. And I let my eyes move across the crowd one more time, not searching for recognition now, but observing. The way you do when you understand that you are no longer part of what you are seeing. A group of younger guests passed near me, their voices bright and animated, talking about travel plans and business deals, and things that seemed so certain in their futures. And one of them glanced at me for a fraction of a second before looking away, his expression unreadable, as if I were just another detail that did not require attention. I adjusted my posture slightly, straightening my shoulders, not out of pride exactly, but out of habit, the same habit that had carried me through years of doing what needed to be done without waiting for acknowledgement. And I realized that this moment, this quiet exclusion, felt familiar in a way I had not wanted to admit before, like the culmination of many smaller moments that had led here, each one easier to overlook on its own, but together forming something undeniable. As the newly married couple moved further into the reception area, surrounded by well-wishers and the easy warmth of acceptance, I remained at the edge, still and composed. And just as I was beginning to turn away, to finally leave without drawing attention, I heard the low, unmistakable sound of a car engine approaching from the long driveway beyond the gates, a sound that did not match the rhythm of the event, a presence that felt out of place in a way I understood immediately, and for reasons I could not yet explain. I paused, my hand resting lightly against the fabric of my coat, and waited. The sound grew louder as the car moved steadily along the long driveway, its engine low and controlled, not rushed, not hesitant, the kind of sound that carried confidence without needing attention. And slowly, conversations near the entrance began to shift, not stopping entirely but thinning just enough for curiosity to settle in, heads turning one by one, subtle at first, then more openly as the vehicle came into view beyond the iron gates. It was not flashy in the way some cars tried to be. There were no exaggerated details or unnecessary displays, just a quiet, unmistakable presence that suggested something far more substantial than decoration. And I watched as it rolled to a smooth stop near the entrance, the gravel barely disturbed beneath its tires, the driver stepping out first with practiced precision before moving to open the rear door. I did not move, not yet, my hands still resting calmly at my sides. But I felt the shift in the air, the kind that does not need to be announced, the kind that people recognize instinctively even if they do not understand it. A few of the guests closer to the entrance straightened their posture, their conversations pausing mid-sentence, and I noticed the woman with the clipboard glance toward the car, her expression changing almost immediately from polite control to something more alert, more attentive, as if she suddenly realized that whatever was about to happen did not fall within her list of responsibilities. The door opened fully, and for a moment there was only a glimpse of movement, a figure stepping out with measured ease, the kind of movement that comes from years of being observed, of being expected, and I saw the reactions ripple outward before I even saw him clearly, a subtle recognition passing from one guest to another, a name perhaps whispered under someone's breath, the kind of recognition that does not need confirmation. I felt it then, not as a thought, but as something quieter, a memory brushing against the edges of my mind, something familiar in the way he carried himself, in the stillness before he took his first step forward, and I found myself watching more closely, not out of curiosity alone, but because something inside me had already begun to respond. He walked toward the entrance without hesitation, his gaze steady, not scanning the crowd, not searching for approval, but moving with purpose. And as he drew closer, the details became clearer, the lines of his face, the calm set of his shoulders, the way people instinctively made space without being asked, stepping aside just enough to create a path. I saw the staff adjust their posture, the woman with the clipboard lowering it slightly, as if unsure whether to speak or remain silent. And the guests who had moments ago been immersed in their own conversations now stood quietly, their attention shifting toward him, in a way that felt almost automatic. He did not acknowledge them immediately, did not offer the quick smiles or nods that people often use to manage attention. Instead, his focus moved past them, beyond the carefully arranged entrance, beyond the line where I stood, and for a brief second I thought he might continue walking, that whatever had brought him here had nothing to do with me. But then his gaze settled, not on the crowd, not on the newly married couple in the distance, but directly on me. The moment stretched, quiet and precise, and I felt something steady within me respond, not surprise, not even anticipation, but a recognition that I could not yet fully explain, as if a piece of a much older story had just been placed back into my hands without warning. And without thinking, I remained exactly where I was, my shoulders straight, my expression calm, as the distance between us slowly began to close. He stopped a few steps in front of me, close enough now that I could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the kind that come from years of responsibility rather than age alone. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the space between us filled with the quiet attention of everyone nearby who had begun to notice that something unusual was unfolding. I studied his face carefully, not searching for recognition in the obvious ways, but allowing memory to move at its own pace. And there it was, not in a single clear image, but in fragments, a younger version of him standing uncertainly in a doorway, shoulders tense, hands unsure of where to rest, a voice asking a question he had not known how to finish, and my own response, simple and steady, offered without expectation of anything in return. He took one final step forward, and then, in a movement so deliberate that it silenced even the faintest whispers around us, he lowered himself, not abruptly, not theatrically, but with a calm precision that made the gesture impossible to misunderstand. His posture straight even as he bent, his gaze lifting to meet mine with a clarity that carried both respect and something deeper, something that felt like acknowledgement long overdue. "Mrs. Collins," he said, his voice measured and warm, carrying just far enough that those closest could hear without him raising it. "I was hoping I would find you here." And the name settled into the air with a weight that shifted everything around it, the murmurs fading, the curiosity sharpening into attention, and I became aware of the stillness that had taken hold of the entrance, as if the entire gathering had paused without being asked. I inclined my head slightly, not out of uncertainty, but out of habit, the same quiet composure that had carried me through countless moments when words were unnecessary. And I answered him in the same tone I had always used, calm and even. "It has been a long time," because it had. Longer than I had allowed myself to measure. He gave a small nod, as if acknowledging not just the time, but everything that had filled it, and then he rose to his feet with the same controlled ease, turning slightly as if only now aware of the people watching, though I knew he had been aware all along. I could feel the shift ripple outward again, stronger this time. No longer curiosity, but something closer to recognition, the kind that changes how people stand, how they look at one another, how they begin to reassess what they thought they understood just moments before. The woman with the clipboard had lowered it completely now, her earlier authority replaced by a careful stillness, and a few guests who had been standing closest took a subtle step back, not out of fear, but out of instinct, creating space around us that had not existed before. I did not look toward Daniel or Olivia, not yet, because this moment was not about them, not in the way they believed it to be, and instead I focused on the man standing in front of me, on the way his presence carried a quiet gravity that did not need to be announced, and I allowed myself to recognize what I had already begun to understand, that the past does not disappear simply because it is no longer spoken of, that sometimes it waits, patient and unassuming, until the moment it is needed again. He glanced briefly toward the reception area, where the celebration had begun to falter at the edges, the easy laughter thinning into uncertain pauses, and then his attention returned to me, steady and unwavering, as if confirming something only the two of us needed to understand. And in that instant I realized that whatever came next would not be loud or dramatic. It would not require raised voices or explanations. It would unfold the same way everything important had always unfolded in my life, quietly, with certainty, and without asking permission from anyone who had chosen not to see me. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted slowly, like a room adjusting to a new understanding, and I could feel the attention turning not just toward the man who had addressed me, but toward me as well, as if my presence had been redefined in a way that no one could ignore anymore. He stood beside me now, not in front, not behind, but aligned in a way that carried its own quiet message, and when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, it did not need to, because the stillness around us had already made space for it. You once told me that dignity is something no one can take from you unless you give it away, he said, his eyes steady, his tone respectful without being performative. I did not understand it then, but I never forgot it. And for a moment I was taken back to that memory more clearly, the small office with its worn desk, the late afternoon light falling across a young man who had been uncertain of his future, who had come to me not because I had power, but because I had listened, because I had answered without judgment, and I had said those words without thinking they would matter beyond that moment. I let a small breath pass, not a sigh, not regret, just acknowledgement, and I answered him the same way I had answered years ago, quietly. It seems you understood it after all, because he had, in ways that did not need to be explained. Behind us, the movement of the reception had slowed further, conversations no longer flowing but stopping in fragments, and I could sense the shift spreading outward, people recalculating what they were witnessing, placing pieces together that had not fit before, and though I had not yet turned to look, I knew that Daniel would have noticed by now, that Olivia would have seen the change in the room, because moments like this do not remain contained, they expand. They reshape everything around them. The man beside me glanced briefly toward the gathering, his expression unchanged, not concerned, not eager, simply aware, and then his attention returned to me as if the rest of it were secondary, as if the only thing that required his focus was the person who had once stood in a very different position and offered him something he had needed. I would not be where I am without that day. He continued, his words measured, each one placed carefully, not for effect, but because they carried weight he did not intend to diminish. There are people who invest in companies, in ideas, in opportunities, but very few invest in people when there is no guarantee of return. You did that, and I have spent a lifetime trying to honor it. And I felt the truth of it settle, not as pride, not as triumph, but as something quieter, something that simply existed whether or not it had ever been recognized. I remained still, my posture unchanged, my expression calm, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required presence, and I allowed that to be enough, the same way it had always been enough when everything else was uncertain. A few steps away, I could hear someone whisper a name, not mine, his, the kind of name that carries recognition beyond introductions, and I could sense the subtle tension that followed. The quiet realization spreading through the guests who understood now that what they were witnessing was not accidental, not trivial, but significant in a way that could not be undone. I did not look at them, I did not seek their acknowledgement, because it was no longer necessary, and instead I kept my attention where it belonged, on the man who had chosen to stop, to recognize, to remember, and in that stillness I understood something with complete clarity. That the measure of a life is not determined by the moments when you are included, but by the impact you leave in the moments when you are not. And as the air around us held that understanding, quiet and undeniable, I knew that whatever came next would not change what had already been revealed. The first person to move was not a guest, but one of the event staff, the same woman who had stood between me and the entrance earlier, and I noticed how her posture had changed completely. The clipboard now held lower, almost forgotten in her hands as she took a careful step forward, her expression no longer firm or dismissive but uncertain, as if she were trying to understand how the situation she thought she controlled had shifted beyond her reach. "Sir," she began, her voice quieter than before, directed toward the man beside me, but she did not finish the sentence, because he turned his head slightly, not sharply, not with irritation, but with a calm authority that made further explanation unnecessary, and she stopped immediately, stepping back into the space she had just occupied as if realizing that whatever role she had been playing no longer applied. The ripple continued outward, subtle but undeniable, and I could feel the attention drawing closer, not physically, but in the way people leaned just slightly, the way conversations faltered and then ceased altogether, replaced by a shared awareness that something important was unfolding at the edge of the celebration. I did not need to look to know that Daniel had finally turned, that Olivia had followed his gaze, Because moments like this do not remain hidden. They demand recognition, and I allowed myself a single glance toward them. Not searching, not accusing, just observing. Daniel stood a few yards away, his posture no longer as composed as it had been at the altar, his attention fixed in our direction. His expression caught somewhere between confusion and something deeper, something he had not prepared for. While Olivia remained at his side, her hand still lightly resting on his arm but no longer guiding. Her gaze sharper now, more focused, as if she were trying to assess the situation rather than react to it. I held that image for only a moment before letting it go, because it was no longer the center of what was happening, and I returned my attention to the man beside me, who had not shifted, had not adjusted his stance to accommodate the growing attention, as if the presence of others did not alter the purpose of his actions. I should have come sooner, he said quietly, not as an apology, not as a performance, but as a simple acknowledgement, and I considered his words carefully before answering, because time has a way of reshaping what matters. You came when you needed to. I replied, my voice steady, because that was the truth that mattered, not the delay, not the distance, but the fact that he had come at all. There was a pause then, not uncomfortable, not uncertain, just a space where understanding settled without needing to be filled, and I became aware again of the stillness around us, the way it held the moment intact, allowing it to unfold. Without interruption, a few more guests had turned fully now, their attention no longer hidden behind polite discretion, and I could sense the quiet recalculations taking place, the shift from assumption to recognition, from dismissal to something closer to respect, though I did not seek it, did not respond to it, because it had never been the reason for anything I had done. The man beside me took a small step forward, not away from me, but slightly angled toward the gathering, as if acknowledging that the moment could not remain contained indefinitely, and his presence alone seemed to draw a line through the space, dividing what had been from what was now becoming clear. I felt no urgency, no need to move or speak beyond what had already been said, because everything that needed to be understood had already begun to take shape. And as the quiet attention of the crowd settled more firmly around us, I stood where I was, unchanged, unhurried, and entirely certain that whatever came next would no longer be defined by who had chosen to exclude me, but by what had just been revealed in their presence. I could feel the moment tightening, not with tension but with focus, as if everything around us had narrowed to a single point. And without raising his voice or making any outward gesture to claim attention, the man beside me spoke again, this time turning slightly so that his words carried just enough to reach beyond the small circle we occupied. There was a time, he said, his tone even and unhurried, when I stood outside a building much like this one, unsure if I would be allowed in, unsure if I even deserved to be. And though he did not look directly at the guests, I knew they were listening, because the stillness had deepened, the kind that comes when people realize they are about to hear something that will change the way they understand what is in front of them. I had nothing that would have impressed anyone, he continued. No position, no influence, no guarantee that I would become anything more than what I was at that moment. And yet someone opened a door for me, not because I had earned it in the ways that are easy to measure, but because she believed that worth is not always visible at first glance. And I felt the words settle into the space around us. Not heavy, not forced, but undeniable, the kind of truth that does not need emphasis to be understood. A few guests shifted slightly, their expressions changing in small, almost imperceptible ways, the polite distance replaced by something more attentive, more aware. And I could sense the quiet recognition beginning to take shape, not fully formed yet, but moving in that direction. That moment did not just give me an opportunity, he said, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. It gave me a standard, a way of seeing people that I have tried to carry with me into every decision I have made since. And he paused then, not for effect, but as if allowing the meaning to settle, as if giving the room time to catch up to something that had already been clear to him for years. I remained still, not reacting outwardly, because this was not a moment that belonged to me in the way the guests might assume. It belonged to something larger, something that had been set in motion long before any of us stood here, and I understood that my role in it had always been the same: to act without expectation, to give without measuring return, and to let the results unfold in their own time. He turned his head slightly then, his attention shifting just enough to include the wider gathering without losing focus. And I saw how the people closest to us straightened, how their expressions adjusted, not out of obligation, but out of an instinctive response to the weight of what was being said. Respect, he added quietly, is not determined by appearance, or by circumstance, or by the roles we assign to one another in a single moment. It is revealed over time, in ways that cannot be arranged or controlled. And as the words settled, I could feel the shift complete itself, the subtle but undeniable change in how I was being seen, not because I had demanded it, not because I had corrected anyone, but because something had been brought into the light that could not be dismissed. I did not turn toward Daniel or Olivia. I did not need to see their reactions to understand that this moment had reached them, that whatever assumptions they had made earlier had begun to fracture under the weight of what was now visible to everyone, and I allowed that realization to exist without attaching anything to it. No satisfaction, no resentment, just acknowledgement. The man beside me stepped back into stillness, his words complete, his presence steady, and for a brief moment the entire space seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something else to happen, something louder or more dramatic. But nothing came, because nothing else was needed, and in that quiet, I understood that the most powerful shifts are often the ones that happen without noise, without confrontation, unfolding in a way that leaves no room for misunderstanding, only recognition. No one spoke at first, not because they did not have something to say, but because whatever words they might have chosen no longer felt sufficient for what had just been revealed, and I stood there quietly, aware of the way the atmosphere had shifted completely, the earlier laughter replaced by a careful stillness that carried something closer to understanding than discomfort. It was Daniel who moved first, not quickly, not with the confidence he had shown earlier, but with a hesitation that seemed almost unfamiliar on him. And as he stepped closer, I could see the conflict written clearly across his face, the kind that does not come from confusion alone, but from the realization that something important has been misjudged. Olivia followed just a step behind, her posture still composed, but the certainty that had defined her earlier now tempered by something more cautious. Her eyes moving between me and the man beside me as if trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer aligned. Daniel stopped a few feet away, close enough that we could see each other clearly without raising our voices, and for a moment he said nothing, his gaze searching my face as if looking for something he had overlooked, something that had always been there, but had gone unnoticed until now. I met his eyes steadily, not with accusation, not with expectation, simply with the same calm presence I had carried through every part of this day. And I let the silence remain, because it belonged to him, not to me. "Mom," he said finally, the word quieter than it had ever been before, not out of distance, but out of weight, as if it carried more meaning now than it had moments earlier, and I could hear the shift in it, the recognition that had not been there before, and I inclined my head slightly in response, not as permission, not as rejection, but as acknowledgement. He drew a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling in a way that suggested he was choosing his next words carefully, and I could see the awareness settling into place, the understanding that this moment could not be undone, that whatever had been revealed would remain long after the day itself had passed. Olivia spoke then, her voice controlled, measured. There seems to have been a misunderstanding, and though the words were polite, the tone carried something else, an attempt to restore order, to reframe what had already shifted beyond her control, and I turned my gaze toward her briefly, not sharply, not dismissively, just enough to acknowledge her presence. There was no misunderstanding. I replied quietly, my voice even, because clarity does not require volume, and I let the words rest there without elaboration, because anything more would have been unnecessary. The man beside me remained still, his presence unchanged, offering neither reinforcement nor interruption, because he did not need to. The moment had already established itself. Daniel looked between us, his expression tightening slightly as the simplicity of my response settled in, and I could see the realization taking hold, not just of what had happened today, but of the pattern that had led to it, the choices made in smaller moments that had now gathered into something undeniable. I felt no urgency to fill the silence that followed, no need to guide the conversation or soften its edges. Because this was not a moment for explanations, it was a moment for recognition, and recognition cannot be forced. After a few seconds, I adjusted my coat gently, smoothing the fabric once more out of habit rather than necessity, and I allowed my gaze to move across the gathering, taking in the faces that now looked at me differently, not because I had changed, but because they had. And then I returned my attention to Daniel, meeting his eyes one last time. "You built a beautiful day," I said, my tone calm, sincere, because it was true, regardless of everything else. "I hope you understand it better than you did a few minutes ago." And I let that be enough, because anything more would have belonged to a different kind of conversation, one that did not need to happen here, in front of people who had only just begun to see. I turned then, not abruptly, not in retreat, but with the same steady composure I had carried from the moment I arrived. And as I began to walk away, I did not look back, not out of pride, not out of distance, but because I understood something with complete certainty, that my place had never been defined by where I was allowed to stand, but by the life I had lived and the impact I had left behind. And that was something no one here had the power to take from me.